Let us pause for a moment and recognize the gravity of what has just unfolded. Arab retaliation begins, a phrase already echoing across global news networks, captures a dramatic new phase in the Middle East conflict. A raid on the Jordan border has reportedly left several Israelis dead, coming swiftly on the heels of a shocking strike against Qatar. This is no isolated skirmish. It is a signpost of a larger unraveling, a reminder that the forces long contained are now bursting forth in unpredictable and deeply consequential ways. The news of the border raid that left Israelis dead at the Jordan-Israel frontier is more than a sudden eruption of violence. It is a moment that jolts the entire region, a moment that commands global attention. The very location of this incident makes it especially dramatic. The Jordanian border has long been viewed as one of the quieter frontiers, a zone of uneasy calm maintained through treaties, security coordination, and the assumption that while tensions raged elsewhere, this line would remain relatively stable. To see blood spilled here shatters that assumption, and in doing so signals that no space in this conflict is safe. No border is beyond the reach of retaliatory anger. The raid is not merely an attack. It is a message written in violence that reverberates far beyond the border itself. When such an event unfolds, the first question that arises is one of timing. Why now? Why at this moment? And the answer is inseparable from the recent Israeli strike on Qatar, which was itself framed as a bold assertion of Israeli power deep into the Gulf. What happened at the border is therefore not random. It is a calculated reply, a carefully staged demonstration that Arab retaliation will not be limited to rhetoric or symbolic gestures. It is action. It is deadly, and it is strategically aimed at Israel's vulnerabilities. The hooks of this story lie precisely in its unpredictability, an attack where many believed Israel was secure, and retaliation where the world least expected it. We must also ask, what does this mean for Israel's security narrative? For decades, Israel has insisted on its ability to contain threats, to project strength across the region, to deter through its military superiority. Yet, deterrence collapses the moment your adversary demonstrates that they can strike where you least anticipate. This raid, therefore, cuts deeper than the casualties it inflicted. It undermines confidence in Israel's protective shield, shaking not just its citizens but also its allies, who now see that Israeli power has limits. For ordinary Israelis, the psychological shock of this attack may prove just as destabilizing as the physical damage. For policymakers, it raises urgent questions: how many borders must be defended and at what cost? The broader regional implications are equally profound. Jordan has long been portrayed as a buffer state, a partner in maintaining a fragile order. But this raid cracks that image. Whether it was directly aided by elements within Jordan or simply carried out along its frontier, the symbolism is unmistakable. It suggests that the conflict is spilling into territories that were once considered stable, and it threatens to drag Jordan into the whirlwind. This is not just an isolated firefight. It is a signal flare warning that the battleground is expanding, that no agreements or old arrangements can prevent the spread of retaliation once it takes root. The global dimension of this cannot be ignored. Western powers, especially the United States, have invested heavily in portraying Israel as both militarily unshakable and politically indispensable. Yet the raid challenges both of these narratives. If Israel cannot secure its own borders, if it cannot prevent deadly incursions even in areas thought safe, then the promise of stability that Washington has long sold to its allies begins to ring hollow. Investors, markets, and policymakers alike will see in this raid a dangerous precedent. Instability creeping into regions once considered safe zones, threatening not only military balance, but also economic confidence. The hook here is that what looks like a border skirmish is in fact a geopolitical tremor, one that could unsettle the entire architecture of alliances in the Middle East. And finally, we must grasp the deeper symbolism of this raid. For many Arabs, this is not merely an act of vengeance. It is seen as a reclamation of agency, a reminder that power will not go unchallenged indefinitely. The raid speaks in the language of desperation, but also of defiance. It is an answer to decades of occupation, blockades, and military dominance, saying clearly, you cannot strike without expecting to be struck in return. That message, however disturbing, will echo far beyond Israel and Jordan. It will embolden some, terrify others, and ensure that this border raid is remembered not just as a violent act, but as the opening line in a chapter of retaliation that has only just begun. The Israeli strike on Qatar was not merely another military operation. It was a bold move designed to project dominance and remind the region that Israel's reach extends far beyond its immediate borders. But in the calculus of power, every action breeds reaction. And this strike has unleashed a chain of consequences that are now reshaping the political and military landscape. Retaliation was not a possibility. It was inevitable. The events that followed, most notably the raid on the Jordanian border, serve as proof that the strike on Qatar has opened the floodgates of Arab anger, transforming simmering tensions into open retaliation. The hook that must not be missed here is that Israel's attempt to display strength has, paradoxically, revealed its vulnerabilities by provoking a level of backlash that could spiral far beyond its control. To understand the gravity of this, one must examine Qatar's position in the regional balance. Qatar has long been a small but influential actor, punching above its weight through media power, diplomatic networks, and financial influence. An attack on Qatari soil is not just an attack on a state, it is a provocation aimed at the symbolic heart of Arab pride and independence. For Israel to strike Qatar is to send a message not just to Doha, but to every Arab capital. What can touch you? We can reach you. We can impose our will wherever we choose. Such a message, while designed to intimidate, has the opposite effect when the collective psychology of a region has been battered by decades of perceived injustice. Instead of instilling fear, it cultivates a spirit of retaliation that begins to unify fragmented factions. That is what we are now witnessing, the emergence of an Arab response that no longer hides in shadows, but instead expresses itself with dramatic force. The retaliation narrative matters because it exposes the limitations of power. Military strikes can destroy infrastructure. They can cripple supply chains. They can send shockwaves across borders. But they cannot extinguish the will of a people who feel cornered. The raid that followed the Qatar strike is not disconnected. It is directly tethered to it. like a spark leaping from one dry branch to another in a forest fire. Each act of aggression now produces a counter-reaction, and what is striking is the speed with which this retaliation came. We are not talking about years or months of preparation. The Arab response unfolded within days, suggesting a readiness and coordination that Israel may not have anticipated. The hook here is the sheer swiftness, proof that the region is no longer waiting to absorb punishment, but is prepared to answer it immediately and decisively. This shift has enormous implications for how the conflict will evolve. For decades, Israel has relied on a doctrine of deterrence, built on the premise that overwhelming force will dissuade adversaries from daring to strike back. The Qatar incident and its aftermath may be the moment that doctrine begins to crumble. If retaliation becomes the norm, if Arab states and groups increasingly see counterattacks as both viable and necessary, then Israel faces a landscape where deterrence no longer works. And once deterrence fails, escalation becomes the only language left. That is a dangerous game, one in which every move risks igniting a larger conflagration. Equally important is the political resonance of the Qatar strike. Across the Arab world, populations already resentful of Israeli policies now see this as proof of unrestrained aggression. Leaders who once hesitated to act out of fear of Western backlash may find themselves compelled to respond simply to preserve their own legitimacy at home. In this way, the strike on Qatar does not isolate Israel's enemies, it multiplies them. The raid on the Jordanian border is thus not the endpoint, but the beginning of a broader wave, one that could see more borders tested, more alliances strained, and more retaliatory actions carried out in the weeks ahead. The hook here is the political domino effect. One strike unleashing a series of responses that could draw in actors who had previously remained cautious or neutral. What emerges from this sequence is a sobering reality. Retaliation is no longer confined to rhetoric or symbolic gestures. It is material, it is deadly, and it is widening the conflict in ways that neither Israel nor its Western backers may be able to contain. The strike on Qatar lit the fuse, but the explosion is unfolding across multiple fronts, and it threatens to redraw the lines of engagement in the Middle East. In trying to assert dominance, Israel may have awakened a level of retaliation that signals a new era, an era in which every strike is answered, every show of strength matched with defiance, and every attempt at control met with rebellion. That is the true legacy of the Qatar strike, and it is why this moment marks a turning point, not just for Israel and its adversaries, but for the entire region. The eruption of violence on the Jordan-Israel border and the strike on Qatar reveal something larger than isolated confrontations. They expose a region where long-contained tensions are finally boiling over. For years, the conflict was perceived as geographically concentrated, primarily within Gaza, occasionally spilling into Lebanon with periodic flare-ups in the West Bank. That was the narrative many in the West and Israel had grown comfortable with, the idea that the fire could be contained, that the battlefield was confined to predictable spaces, that the violence could be managed. But now, with clashes breaking out along Jordan's frontier and retaliations echoing beyond the traditional zones of conflict, that illusion of containment has been shattered. The hook here is stark. What was once viewed as a local problem is now transforming into a regional crisis, and the borders that once seemed firm lines of separation are rapidly becoming lines of escalation. It is critical to understand why this shift matters so profoundly. Containment has been the cornerstone of Israeli strategy for decades. By isolating the conflict to Gaza or Lebanon, Israel could claim both to its people and to the international community that the situation, though tragic, was under control. When instability is localized, it can be dismissed as a problem of militants, extremists, or rogue actors. But when instability spills across borders, when it touches countries like Jordan that were long portrayed as pillars of relative stability, the narrative collapses. Suddenly the world sees not a conflict that can be managed, but a conflict that is metastasizing, consuming the very borders that once restrained it. That is a dramatic shift in perception, and perception shapes politics, alliances, and international pressure. The spread of violence into Jordan's frontier is particularly symbolic because Jordan has long played the role of mediator, buffer, and quiet ally of the West. Its peace treaty with Israel was supposed to represent a model of coexistence, proof that Arab-Israeli rapprochement was possible. Now, that very frontier is a site of bloodshed. Whether Jordan directly supported the raid or not is almost irrelevant. The fact that it happened there sends a message of fragility, of alliances under strain, of treaties that cannot guarantee peace when the underlying grievances remain unresolved. The hook here is that even safe states can no longer remain insulated. The pressure cooker of the Palestinian struggle and broader Arab frustration is breaking through the walls erected to contain it. There is also the psychological effect across the Arab world. For decades, many ordinary Arabs looked at Gaza as a symbol of resistance, but also as a cage. Resistance was confined, crushed, and rarely able to break out. Lebanon, through Hezbollah, would periodically flare, but the geographic and political boundaries kept the violence from expanding further. Now, however, the battlefield is no longer predictable. Jordan's involvement, or even its inability to prevent such a raid, signals to Arab populations that the fight is spreading, that retaliation can emerge anywhere, that the struggle is no longer trapped within Gaza's borders. This emboldens those who feel oppressed and terrifies those who thought they could avoid being pulled into the conflict. For Israel, this development is nothing short of alarming. A conflict with Gaza and Hezbollah is already a strain. Opening additional fronts along Jordan, potentially Syria, or even beyond, stretches its resources and fractures its strategic posture. Israel has long relied on the belief that it can dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when and where to strike. But when violence begins to spill unpredictably across the region, Israel loses control of the map. Every new border raid, every cross-border retaliation, erodes its aura of invulnerability and forces it to confront the terrifying possibility of a multi-front confrontation. The hook that must be highlighted here is that Israel's greatest fear has always been encirclement, and what we are seeing now are the first steps toward precisely that scenario. The global powers observing this escalation understand the stakes. The United States, Britain, and European governments have long reassured themselves and their publics that the conflict, while tragic, could be quarantined. They could continue their alliances, their arms sales, their strategic commitments without fear of the conflict spinning out of control. But the spillover effect changes that calculation. Suddenly, instability threatens Jordan, a key Western partner. Suddenly, the region looks like it could erupt into a wildfire that destabilizes not just local politics, but also global energy supplies, trade routes, and alliances. What began as a clash over borders and strikes now threatens to unravel the fragile architecture that has kept Western interests secure for decades. This moment forces us to see the Middle East not as a collection of isolated conflicts, but as an interconnected landscape where every strike and counterstrike ripples outward. The illusion of containment is gone, and with it, the false comfort that the violence could be controlled. What lies ahead is a period of volatility where the boundaries between local and regional have dissolved, and where every border has the potential to become a flashpoint. The hooks are all too clear. Israel's enemies are no longer confined. The battlefield is expanding, and the cost of ignoring the underlying injustices is now spilling over in ways that no wall, no treaty, and no rhetoric can hold back. The spectacle of Arab unity emerging from the chaos is perhaps the most striking development of all, for it represents a shift that many dismissed as impossible only months ago. For decades, the Arab world has been fractured, plagued by internal rivalries, divided by sectarianism, and manipulated by external powers. Israel, along with its Western allies, relied on that division as a cornerstone of its strategic advantage, as long as Arab states remained splintered. Any retaliation could be dismissed as isolated, any resistance crushed without fear of a broader coalition. Yet the recent sequence of events, the strike on Qatar, the deadly raid at the Jordanian border, the rising rhetoric in capitals once considered cautious, suggests that those fractures are narrowing. The hook here is that unity, however fragile, is beginning to manifest in ways that transform the landscape of power, signaling that Arab retaliation may no longer be sporadic, but coordinated. This emerging unity is not necessarily born out of ideology or grand political vision. It is forged instead out of shared humiliation and shared anger. Qatar's strike was not just a wound to Doha. It was felt across the region as a symbolic assault on Arab sovereignty. The raid along Jordan's frontier was not just revenge for one act. It was a declaration that no single Arab state can be targeted without stirring others. Even states that have long walked carefully, balancing relations with Israel and the West, now find themselves cornered by public outrage and by the risk of being seen as passive in the face of aggression. In this environment, hesitation is no longer politically viable. The hook lies in the shift of incentives. Unity is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity for survival. The symbolism of unity itself is powerful. For years, Arab leaders have convened summits, issued statements of solidarity, but rarely backed words with meaningful action. The populations they govern grew cynical, resigned to the idea that unity was an illusion. But when blood is spilled across multiple borders and retaliations echo in unison, the image of unity takes on new credibility. Even if coordination remains loose, even if rivalries still exist beneath the surface, the appearance of collective action is enough to reshape perception. That perception alone can alter the behavior of states and peoples, fueling a momentum that is often more powerful than the reality on the ground. This momentum threatens to undo Israel's carefully cultivated strategy of normalization. Over the past few years, deals like the Abraham Accords were hailed as proof that Arab states were willing to sidestep the Palestinian issue in pursuit of economic and security partnerships with Israel. But the retaliation cycle following the Qatar strike and the Jordan raid risks unraveling those agreements. Public opinion across the Arab world has turned sharper, and leaders who ignore that shift risk political unrest at home. Suddenly, normalization looks less like a diplomatic triumph and more like a fragile construct, vulnerable to collapse under the weight of Arab solidarity in times of crisis. The hook here is that Israel's long game of dividing its neighbors may be unraveling faster than it can contain. There is also a psychological transformation underway. For decades, the Arab world internalized a sense of weakness in the face of Israeli and Western power. Disunity reinforced that weakness, and every failed summit, every broken alliance, deepened the despair. But unity, even glimpses of it, restores a sense of agency. The raid at the Jordan border, linked symbolically to the Qatar strike, is more than a military act. It is proof that collective action can inflict pain. That retaliation backed by multiple voices cannot be so easily ignored. This change in psychology may prove even more dangerous to Israel than the attacks themselves, because it builds confidence among populations long subdued. Confidence is contagious, and once it spreads, it can be nearly impossible to suppress. For the West, the emergence of Arab unity is a troubling development. Washington, London, and European capitals have long relied on the assumption that Arab disunity would keep the region manageable. Arms sales bases and alliances were structured around the certainty that no coalition could form strong enough to challenge Western dominance. But now, with states rallying around a shared sense of retaliation, the calculus changes. Western governments must suddenly reckon with the possibility that what they dismissed as a fractured Arab world could, under enough pressure, align against them in ways that threaten not only Israel's position, but also their broader regional influence. The hook that emerges is the fear of the unpredictable unity, turning from symbolism to strategy, from protest to policy, reshaping the entire power balance of the Middle East. The flickers of Arab unity may not yet be a blazing fire, but they are embers glowing brighter with every new act of aggression and every retaliatory strike. Once considered impossible, unity now feels within reach, driven not by lofty ideals but by the shared reality of survival. That is what makes this moment so consequential. For the first time in decades, the Arab world is beginning to look less like a fractured landscape and more like a chorus of voices, angry, defiant, and ready to act. And that chorus is the sound that Israel and its allies most fear, for it suggests that retaliation is no longer isolated noise. It is becoming a collective roar. Israel now finds itself staring into the abyss of a nightmare it has long sought to avoid, the opening of multiple fronts that stretch its military, intelligence, and political resources to their breaking point. For decades, its defense doctrine rested on the idea of decisive superiority, the ability to dominate militarily in any single arena, to strike quickly, and to neutralize threats before they multiplied. But what happens when threats emerge not from one direction, but from many? The raid along the Jordan border, following hard on the heels of the Qatar strike, makes that question more urgent than ever. The hook here is undeniable. Israel is being forced into a situation where its legendary capacity for control looks less like dominance and more like desperation, as new fronts crack open one after another. Historically, Israel has prided itself on preparing for war on several borders. The memory of the 1967 and 1973 wars shaped its entire military structure, pushing for readiness against simultaneous threats from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and beyond. Yet the difference today lies in the complexity of the challenges. These are not conventional armies arrayed neatly on battlefields. They are diffuse, asymmetric threats that manifest in raids, rockets, cyber attacks, and political upheavals. A strike from Gaza can coincide with a Hezbollah barrage in the north, while Jordan becomes a new point of infiltration, and strikes against Gulf states such as Qatar stir wider outrage. To fight on one front is taxing. To face fire from many directions is destabilizing in ways that military might alone cannot fix. The Jordan raid carries special weight precisely because it breaks the illusion of secure borders. Gaza was expected, Lebanon was expected, but Jordan, long seen as a buffer and even a quiet partner, was not. If violence can seep through there, what about Syria? What about the Sinai? Each new point of conflict adds not just tactical strain but psychological pressure, leaving Israeli citizens wondering, where is safe? Where is secure? What line will hold? Fear begins to multiply, and with fear comes the erosion of political confidence in leadership. The hook here is that Israel's military problem quickly becomes a political one as its citizens lose faith in the promise of safety that every government has sworn to deliver. The global dimension cannot be ignored. The United States and Western allies have invested heavily in portraying Israel as an island of security in a volatile region. That reputation has been one of Israel's greatest diplomatic assets, used to justify aid, weapons, and political backing. But the appearance of multiple active fronts undermines that image. If Israel looks vulnerable, if it looks besieged, then the narrative of stability collapses. For Washington, this is not merely a question of sympathy for an ally. It is a strategic crisis. How do you reassure allies in the Gulf or in Europe when Israel itself appears at risk of being overwhelmed? The hook here is the collapse of credibility. When Israel falters, so too does the West's claim to having built a durable security order in the Middle East. And then there is the economic angle, often overlooked but no less important. Fighting on multiple fronts drains resources at a pace that even Israel, with its advanced economy, cannot sustain indefinitely. Mobilizing reserves, maintaining deployments across borders, and sustaining long campaigns is expensive. The global economy watches nervously, aware that instability in the region rattles energy markets, trade routes, and investor confidence. For Israel, the cost is twofold: the direct burden of war spending and the indirect burden of eroded economic stability. When businesses hesitate, when markets shiver, the pressure mounts not just on generals but on politicians, who must answer for why their promised control has turned into open-ended chaos. The danger that looms largest, however, is the strategic one. A multi-front conflict is not just about strain, it is about exposure. Israel cannot afford to concentrate all its power in one direction without leaving another vulnerable. Every missile battery, every air unit, Every intelligence team pulled to one front leaves a gap elsewhere. Adversaries know this, and they exploit it. The raid on the Jordan border was not just about inflicting casualties, it was about demonstrating that Israel's defenses can be penetrated where it least expects it. That message emboldens others, encouraging more strikes, more infiltrations, more challenges, until Israel finds itself constantly reacting rather than controlling. The hook here is the shift in momentum. Israel no longer dictating the battlefield, but being forced to chase it. In the end, the prospect of multiple fronts is not merely a military problem, but a systemic one. It erodes deterrence, it undermines political legitimacy, it strains alliances, and it threatens the economy. Each new front is like a crack in a dam, and once enough cracks appear, the structure can collapse under its own weight. That is the specter Israel now faces, and it is why this moment feels less like another episode in a long conflict and more like the beginning of something larger, more dangerous, and far harder to contain. The walls are closing in, and for the first time in decades, Israel is being forced to confront the possibility that its greatest fear, encirclement, may no longer be a distant scenario, but a present reality unfolding in real time. The developments in the region have not only rattled Israel and its immediate neighbors, but have sent shockwaves across the corridors of power in Washington. London, Brussels, and beyond, global powers now find themselves watching uneasily, aware that what appears to be a regional escalation has the potential to destabilize international systems far beyond the Middle East. The raid on the Jordan border following the Qatar strike has become more than just a story of local retaliation. It is a moment that forces the world to confront the fragility of the order it has relied upon for decades. The hook here is stark. When the Middle East burns, the flames never stay contained, and the ripple effects inevitably reach the global stage, shaking markets, alliances, and strategic calculations. For the United States, the implications are particularly severe. Washington has anchored its Middle Eastern policy on the idea of Israel as an unshakable ally and cornerstone of regional stability. Billions of dollars in military aid, years of political backing, and countless diplomatic maneuvers have been invested into preserving that image. But if Israel appears overwhelmed, if it faces real threats from multiple directions while retaliation spreads unpredictably, then the U.S. narrative of stability collapses. Already stretched by commitments in Europe and Asia, Washington must now weigh whether it has the capacity or the will to deepen its involvement in another escalating conflict. The hook that emerges here is one of strategic overload. America, the self-declared guarantor of global order, may be discovering that its promises far exceed its reach. Europe, too, feels the tremors in ways that cut deeper than politics. Energy dependence ties European economies to the Gulf, and any instability triggered by Israel's actions reverberates through oil and gas markets almost instantly. The strike on Qatar alone unsettled markets. The Jordan raid compounds that unease, suggesting a conflict with no clear limits. For European capitals already grappling with economic fragility, rising populism, and political divisions, the last thing they can afford is another external crisis, inflaming prices and destabilizing supply chains. The hook here is economic vulnerability. The further this conflict spreads, the more ordinary citizens across Europe will feel its effects in their bills, their jobs, and their politics, forcing leaders to respond to a crisis they cannot control. Beyond economics lies the strategic chessboard. Western powers have long relied on the image of a divided Arab world, fragmented and incapable of uniting against Western-backed system. But the retaliations following the Qatar strike and Jordan raid have shown flickers of a different reality, one where anger unites across borders, where states once deemed cautious begin to lean toward confrontation. This unsettles not only Israel but also its Western backers, who recognize that if Arab coordination grows, their own influence in the region could weaken. The hook here is the erosion of dominance. What the West built through decades of divide and rule may now be unraveling, leaving a vacuum that rivals like China or Russia will not hesitate to fill. Markets, meanwhile, respond not to ideology but to instability, and they are already nervous. Investors understand that instability in the Middle East does not stay confined to deserts and borders. It spills into oil futures, shipping routes, and global trade. Every retaliatory strike, every border clash increases the perception of risk. And risk, in the language of markets, translates into higher costs, lower confidence, and flight from uncertainty. The Qatar strike was seen as bold but destabilizing. The Jordan raid suggests that retaliation is spreading. If this trend continues, the global economy may find itself hostage to a cycle of conflict that no superpower seems able to stop. The geopolitical consequences are equally unsettling. Russia and China, watching closely, may see opportunity in this chaos. As the U.S. grapples with overstretch, Moscow and Beijing can position themselves as alternative partners to states disillusioned with Western inaction or hypocrisy. If Arab states begin drifting away from Western spheres of influence, the balance of global power could tilt in ways that will outlast the immediate conflict. The hook here is the global shift. A regional conflict becoming the trigger for a reordering of alliances on a worldwide scale. Ultimately, what unnerves global powers most is the unpredictability of the moment. Contained conflicts can be studied, managed, and manipulated, but a conflict spilling across borders, driven by retaliation and fueled by public outrage, is volatile in ways that defy conventional strategy. Leaders in Washington, London, and Brussels are left asking not simply how to respond to Israel's actions, but whether they can prevent a broader unraveling that could touch their own societies directly. The hook is that unpredictability is itself a weapon, the fear that no one knows how far this escalation will go, and that fear alone destabilizes systems meant to provide order. The raid at the Jordan border, following the Qatar strike, has therefore become more than a story of bloodshed in the desert. It is a warning to global powers that the architecture they have relied upon is cracking, and that the Middle East is once again asserting its role as the world's fault line. What happens here will not stay here. It will ripple outward, shaping economies, politics, and alliances across the globe. And in that reality lies the greatest hook of all, the recognition that in this conflict, no one, not even the most distant observer, can afford to look away.